Good evening, everyone, and an early happy St. Patrick's Day. My name is Emily Hill-Wright, and I am the Director of Operations at the Merchants House Museum. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to In the Footsteps of Bridget Murphy, a virtual house tour. During this evening's tour, if you do have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen, and I would be happy to answer any questions if we have time at the end of the tour. Before we meet Bridget Murphy, let's set the stage. The Merchants House on East 4th Street was built in 1832. But our story begins a decade before with the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825. The Erie Canal was really transformative and helped to turn New York from a small port city into a thriving metropolis. Goods could now come in through New York. They could be sent up the Hudson River and out the Erie Canal to the rest of North America. Lots of goods were coming into New York, lots of people were coming into New York, and lots of money was coming into New York. And so this brand new merchant class, men who imported and exported goods, made a tremendous amount of money in the 1820s and 30s. At the time, all of New York City was located downtown by the seaport, which had become increasingly congested, noisy, and dirty. And so this new wealthy merchant class began looking for a quieter, cleaner, and less crowded place to live. And on an island, they went the only direction they could, uptown. These wealthy individuals chose what was then known as the Bond Street area. So you see the map to the left of your screen. That little red dot there on 4th Street is the Merchants House. And the Bond Street area ran from Art Street in the northern boundary, now Astor Place, down to Bleecker Street, and from Broadway at the west over to Bowery at the east. Lafayette Place, which you see outlined in red there, was a brand new street in 1825. It was cut through in 1825. And so you see between Lafayette Place in 25 and the Merchants House being built in 32, this neighborhood developed very quickly. Demand to live in this neighborhood happened really fast. And so the houses were all put up very quickly as a direct response to this demand of these wealthy individuals. And so houses, as a result, were very similar to one another architecturally. The illustration to the right of your screen, you see Bond Street, and you can see all of the houses there that are lining Bond Street are really very, very similar to one another, almost like little cookie cutter houses. The newspaper ad at the bottom of your screen is for the Merchants House. This was printed in 1834. And you can see the ad talks about an elegant 3-story dwelling that is replete with every convenience. And so we'll talk about what some of these modern conveniences are as we make our way through the house today. But in a wealthy neighborhood, having a house that was replete with every convenience was expected for this wealthy neighborhood. And so here we are then at the Merchants House on 4th Street. This is a desirable neighborhood. And as we said, the houses were all very similar, both architecturally in terms of their floor plan, but also in terms of their decoration and their interior design. Today, we might make personal choices in home decor in order to express our individuality or our own personal style. But in the 19th century, these wealthy families really wanted their homes to look just like their neighbors, to show that they really belonged in this wealthy class. This is actually really useful to us today because the people who lived in these homes used their homes in similar ways. And so through diaries and letters of the period, as well as, of course, through the house itself, we can get a really clear picture of how families in this neighborhood and their Irish servants lived. And so this is something I really encourage you to think about during today's tour. The physical structure of a house has an enormous impact on the way that people, including servants, live and work in that space. In 1835, the Merchants House was purchased by Seabury Treadwell. You can see him in the left side of your screen, and his wife, Eliza. Seabury Treadwell was born out on Long Island and came to New York as a young man, where he made his fortune as a hardware merchant. Hardware in the 19th century is not just hammers and nails and things we might get at a hardware store today, but really anything made out of metal. And so that would have also included things like farming equipment, as well as things like guns and ammunition. Seabury and Eliza paid $18,000 for the merchant's house in 1835, and they moved in with their then 7 children. The oldest, Elizabeth, was a teenager, and the youngest, Sarah, was under a year old. 5 years later, in 1840, Eliza gave birth to the couple's 8th and final child, a daughter named Gertrude. Gertrude was born in the merchant's house, and she lived there her entire life. She never married, and she died in the house in 1933, so nearly 100 years after her father had purchased the home. The merchant's house opened as a museum only 3 years later, in 1936, and today the museum is complete with the Treadwell family's original furnishings and personal possessions. But today we are going to talk about the other members of the household who lived in the merchant's house alongside the Treadwell family in the 19th century, their servants. In the mid-19th century, the Treadwells had 4 live-in servants, and we know this from census records. And so on your screen here is the 1855 New York State Census. You can see we've got S. Treadwell up here at the top, and then all the other members of the family. Until you get to the bottom of the list, here are the servants. And so you can see, looking at this census, all 4 of these women, Anne Clark, Bridget Murphy, Mary James, and Mary Smith, are all immigrants. None of them were born in the United States. 3 of them here are from Ireland. Bridget, at the top of the list, is 19 years old and has been in New York for only 2 years. Today, we are going to be going through this house the way that Bridget might have seen it when she was just starting out as a brand new servant, freshly arrived from America. As an aside, Bridget, of course, is a very common Irish name, but it was so common to have Irish servants in your home that Bridget actually became a slang term. And so instead of talking about the maids in your home, you might talk about the Bridgets that you had in your house. Or you might call all of your servants Bridget. So even if her name were actually Mary or Anne or Catherine, you might call her Bridget anyway. So who was Bridget? Other than the information on that New York State Census, we don't know anything for certain about Bridget Murphy. We don't know where in Ireland she came from or what happened to her after 1855. And so on our tour today, Bridget really becomes an everywoman. She is a stand-in for the thousands of young Irish women who worked in service in New York in houses like the Merchant's House. The photographs you see on your screen were taken in the Merchant's House a few years ago by photographer Hal Hirschhorn, who uses a camera fitted with a 19th century lens. Hal develops his images using the salt print process that was first invented in the 1830s. And so although we have no images of the servants who lived and worked at the Merchant's House, we hope that these evocative photographs pay tribute to Bridget and to her colleagues. Like many young women in service, Bridget is an immigrant to America from Ireland. The life in Ireland that she left behind was likely from a small rural farming community. She has traveled to America alone in search of work in service in houses like this one to support her family while they struggle during the Irish potato famine. The potato famine, as you may know, was a blight on the potato crop in Ireland in the 1840s that caused massive hunger and starvation, which caused people to emigrate. In the 1840s, the Irish comprised half of all immigrants to the United States. Bridget might speak some English and have a basic education, but she is untrained in the skills necessary for life in America and in skills for this job. So, for example, she most likely had a dirt floor at her home in Ireland, not wood and carpeting like we see at the Merchant's House. After Bridget's family and community scraped together the $20 that it cost to send her to America, and after a multi-month-long boat journey alone to a strange country, Bridget arrived here in Lower Manhattan in search of work. Jobs in domestic service are bountiful for young Irish women, and so that is why she has come here. Remember, the Erie Canal brought in so much money to New York. And what that means is families that couldn't afford servants only a couple generations ago now have enough disposable income to hire multiple live-in servants. Houses like this one are new for the city of New York. And these wealthy people, like the Treadwells that live in these houses, need servants to help everything run smoothly. So, how did Bridget get a job? Jobs were so plentiful that Bridget really can find a job right away. She has a couple options in the 1850s. There are for profit intelligence offices that take a fee from servants and employers for placing them together. These for profit intelligence offices could often be nefarious and took advantage of both employee and employer. There were also nonprofit employment agencies run by the city or the Catholic Church to help place young women in new jobs. But most often, it is family, friends, or word of mouth of both servants and employers alike that helps a girl like Bridget find a job. The demand is so high for servants at this time that 60% of employed Irish women in New York City are working in service. And according to that 1855 New York State Census, servants are actually the single largest occupational class in New York City. So the city is filled to the brim with young Irish women working in service. We know their story from census records, from banking data, and from diaries and letters from the 19th century. We know that the hours were very long and the work was hard. But from their letters, mostly we know too that they were desperately lonely while trying to make a new life in this strange city. Their story is often forgotten when we talk about the history of New York, but they actually changed the face of New York forever. So once Bridget has found a job at the Treadwell home and she arrives here to start her work, what happens next? We are going to enter the house on the ground floor, the lowest level in the house, and we're going to start in this front room here, closest to the street, the family room. The family room here is a private family-only space used by the Treadwell family. The Treadwells would have used this room very much like we use a family room today. This would have been sort of their all-purpose hangout space. Little children would have played in this room. Older children would have done schoolwork here in this room. But this is not a room where the family would have invited guests. This was really just for family use. The sofa in this room, for example, is one that the Treadwells brought with them when they moved into this house. This sofa dates to the 1820s. And so by the time Bridget is working here in 1855, this is a 30-year-old sofa. This is no longer a stylish piece of furniture. But it makes sense that the Treadwell family has sort of tucked it away down here in the family room where it can still be very functional, but they can spend their money on new, very stylish furniture for the rooms that they use for entertaining upstairs. However, this is a room where Mrs. Treadwell would meet with tradespeople and where she would interview servants like Bridget. And so there are details in this room, like this beautiful marble fireplace, that leave no doubt that this is a wealthy home. And so, as we said, most likely this was the room where Bridget would have been interviewed and hired by Mrs. Treadwell, there to the left of your screen, or later in the 19th century by one of the Treadwell daughters. We know that Phoebe, pictured at the right of your screen here, took over some of the servant hiring responsibilities from her mother once she became an adult. So Mrs. Treadwell would meet with Bridget and would explain the requirements of the job, and then the two of them would negotiate wages, time off, and that sort of thing. Bridget, being a newly arrived immigrant and an untrained servant, was most likely making average servant wages somewhere between $3 and $4 a month, with room and board here in the Treadwell house included. This is actually almost double what was available for women in other jobs. And having room and board in a safe and clean neighborhood included was a huge perk. Highly trained servants, particularly cooks, could command much more money. And also the number of people in a household could impact wages as well as the labor involved. For example, a newborn baby in a house would create a lot more labor, and so a servant could negotiate for higher wages. Attempting to get higher pay elsewhere was one of the main reasons that servants left their jobs. Once Bridget has been at her job for a while and develops the skills required of her, she can ask for more money, or she could quit this job and find another one. Even with as many young Irish women as were pouring into New York in the mid 19th century, the demand still outpaced supply. And so Bridget does have some leverage. Bridget most likely would have had Thursday nights free, which was common for servants, and also some time off on Sunday for church. Church attendance was likely a source of tension between Bridget and Mrs. Treadwell. The Treadwells were Episcopalian, like most of the wealthy people who lived in this neighborhood. And Bridget, like many young Irish servant women, is Catholic and probably very active in her church community here in America. This might not seem like such a huge divide today, but in the 1850s, this was a huge cultural difference that would have caused a lot of friction in the household. The Irish experienced a lot of prejudice in America at this time, as they were seen as new cultural outsiders. In this newspaper ad to the right of your screen from 1855, you can see that only one ad here contains that now famous "No Irish Need Apply." But if you look closely, every other ad in this section also requests only Protestant workers, effectively barring Irish immigrants from these jobs. However, after ironing out all of the details of her new job, Bridget would hear about her tasks for the week. So Mrs. Treadwell would have a set timeline of jobs and required Bridget that were required of Bridget on different days of the week. So this wouldn't vary too greatly unless there was a dinner party or some other special occasion. A set timeline is hugely important in this house to ensure that the family is not running into servants constantly throughout the house. It's a real choreographed routine in this house. You'll notice as we make our way through the house today that there is no back staircase at this in this house. And so at the beginning of the tour, I encourage you to think about the way that the architecture of the house impacts how people are living here. And so that's a real clear example of that. The kitchen, also on this ground floor level, is a really important room for servants. Bridget would start her day off here in this room before dawn. Servants were expected to get up well before the family was awake. One advice manual explains that an hour that you are at work before the family is awake is worth more than 2 once they're awake. I like saying that on tours, and I once had a woman respond that it's just like that with her kids, that if she's not up at least an hour before they are, she doesn't get anything done. There were 4 servants in this house, as we said at the beginning of the tour. There was a cook. The cook had a helper. There was a parlor maid primarily responsible for the parlor floor, and also a chambermaid primarily responsible for the bedroom floor. However, it's important to remember that other than the cook, it is likely that Bridget and the 2 others were largely maids of all work and would have had duties in all aspects of housework. She would not have had very specific jobs or tasks like you see in huge houses. If we think about sort of Gilded Age houses in Newport, Rhode Island, or great big manor estates in England, where you've got a sort of an army of servants and each one has a very specific job. Bridget and the other servants would have been responsible for doing any sort of work that needed to be done. However, if Bridget has just been hired, that makes her the junior servant, and so she is unfortunately responsible for some of the worst tasks. And one of the most difficult tasks in a house like this is keeping the house warm. Any radiators that you see in the house today were installed when the house was converted into a museum in the 1930s. The entire time that the Treadwells lived here, they relied on coal. Coal was delivered through a chute in the sidewalk down to the cellar. And so you see that coal chute there to the right of your screen. And Bridget would get up in the morning and she would get her bucket of coal and she'd walk down to the cellar, fill up her bucket with coal, and then start climbing stairs. And so she'd climb up to the ground floor level. And of course, there's the kitchen fireplace and also the fireplace in the family room. And you climb up another flight of stairs to the parlor floor, 2 fireplaces there. Another flight up to the primary bedroom floor, same thing, 2 fireplaces on that floor. One more flight, children's bedrooms, same thing, 2 fireplaces there. And then finally, that last flight of stairs that Bridget has to climb. It's something like 90 stairs that she would climb with her heavy bucket of coal before she could heat her own bedroom. When the Merchant's House was built in 1832, coal stoves existed, but they were new technology. And as today, people were really hesitant to adopt this newfangled technology. And so when the house was first built, there was simply an open hearth for cooking, like we see in this photograph here. This is something that Bridget would have been familiar with from back home in Ireland, cooking over an open hearth. However, by mid-century, the Treadwells installed a coal cook stove. With 8 burners and several ovens, the stove enabled the cook to make lots of different dishes at different temperatures, all at the same time with much greater ease. However, there was a steep learning curve to a stove like this. The temperature was controlled with dampers, so how much air you allowed in would impact the oxygen levels and thus the strength of the fire. But there were no thermostats, and so it was difficult to tell when the right temperature had been reached, and it was easy for the fire to accidentally go out. This was likely a huge adjustment for Bridget, who would have been familiar cooking over an open hearth. Learning this new technology she had likely never seen before would have been a real challenge, and something that we know many servants wrote home or complained about. However, when thinking about this stove, I do imagine that for servants who might have used a stove like this at a previous job, for instance, they must have been so relieved when the Treadwells finally installed a coal stove. Once you're comfortable with the new technology, it was certainly easier and safer to cook on a stove like this one versus an open hearth. You can imagine today when you get a new computer or a new phone, and it takes a little while to figure out the new technology. But then once you're used to it, you would never want to go back to the technology that you used 10 years ago. In addition to the difficulty of learning how a stove like this works, there is also the cleaning. This stove is made of iron, and so it needs to be thoroughly dried after cleaning. Periodically, Bridget would have also been responsible for blacking the stove, which is rubbing it all over with this waxy stove polish. This was an extremely arduous task, but really necessary. The elaborate dinner parties that we associate with the end of the 19th century, this sort of course after course of food, really was impossible without technology like this. And so it's an example of the way that new technology is changing the way that people are living their lives. It's changing the kind of food that people are eating. It's changing the way that families are entertaining their friends. And of course, Bridget had to learn too and was a part of this change. Um, of course, one of the servants was a cook, and so she really had domain of this kitchen from morning until night, preparing 3 meals a day for at least 14 people who were living in this house in 1855. Daily tasks for Bridget in the kitchen could have included helping with cooking, helping prep ingredients, so chopping vegetables, peeling potatoes, and also preparing the beehive oven. You see to the left of the stove here, the beehive oven is built into the brick. Here's the opening of that beehive oven. It's dome shaped like a beehive on the inside. And it works very much like a brick pizza oven. If you've been to a restaurant with a brick pizza oven today, you build your fire inside the oven. And of course, the bricks become extremely hot. As the oven cooled down over the course of the day, you would bake things that needed progressively lower and lower temperatures. So you'd start your day baking things that need a very high temperature, like bread. Bread was an absolute staple of the 19th century diet. Bread was served at every single meal. One bread recipe from 1841 calls for 21 quarts of flour to make enough bread for a family of 4 or 5. As we said, in 1855, when Bridget worked in this house, there were 14 people living in the merchant's house. And so if we do that math, that's over 60 quarts of flour. The entire bread baking process, from mixing the dough, kneading the dough, shaping the loaves, letting them rise, and then the baking, took about 4.5 hours. So you could really spend the entire day on bread baking. Unfortunately for Bridget and the other servants, this was not a job that you could do without scrutiny. Bread was considered so important that Mrs. Treadwell certainly kept a close eye on the entire process. Ladies' manuals actually instructed wealthy women that they themselves should be prepared to take over the bread baking for the family if the cook was not up to the task. As a woman who served bad bread was considered a bad hostess. It was also thought that, you're serving your family. And so a lot of etiquette manuals or housekeeping manuals have almost this moralistic tone that if you let your cook serve your family bad bread, that makes you like a bad wife or a bad mother. One manual from 1839 reassures wealthy women that, quote, kneading the dough will make the fairest hands fairer and softer, the exercise giving that healthy pink glow to the palm and nails, which is so beautiful. So sort of reassuring wealthy women that you're not going to get hideous muscles or calluses from pitching in and kneading bread dough, but rather you'll have very feminine hands by helping out in this area. Water is a really interesting question in the 19th century. Here in the Merchant's House kitchen, we have this sink in the corner and then these utility tubs here between the windows, as you see. And water is a tricky question because the Croton Reservoir, which provided New York City with its first municipal water supply, didn't open until 1842. So that's 10 whole years after the Merchant's House was built. And so what do? Everybody still needs water. And if there's no city water system, what are your options? If you live downtown and you're in a poor household, you would rely on neighborhood wells. There would be wells throughout the city, maybe outside your building or down the street. And so you would go out with a bucket and you'd pump water into your bucket and then you'd carry your water home again. So every time you needed water, you would have to go out and pump that water. The problem, of course, with well water is that it pumps groundwater, which particularly as the city became more and more populated, that groundwater became more and more contaminated and was often the source of outbreaks of disease. You see the illustration to the right of your screen, Death's Dispensary sort of warns of the dangers of drinking tainted water. The Treadwells are a wealthy family living in a wealthy neighborhood, and so they don't have to worry about well water. They rely on a cistern. There's a cistern out in the backyard, buried in the backyard. You can see the lid of it here to the left of your screen. And then here's that same lid to the right of the screen in this photograph from the 1970s when the cistern was excavated. The cistern contained a couple thousand gallons of rainwater, which was then pumped into the kitchen space, which means that from the time this house was built in 1832, this kitchen had running water. The pipe segment you see here circled in red in this kitchen is also original to the house, 1832, and its placement indicates that there may have even been a water heater in this kitchen, which would have meant both hot and cold running water. Imagine how Bridget felt. You've come to New York from Ireland, where you were living with your whole family in a small house, a small cottage, and your first job is in this house with hot and cold running water. I mean, just what an astonishing luxury. The problem, of course, with New York not having a municipal water supply until 1842 and not having a city sewer system is that the city was filthy. And so you notice we do have some rats here in this kitchen. Dealing with pests, with mice, rats, cockroaches, and other vermin would have been something that Bridget would have dealt with on a daily basis. On the opposite side of this room is this piece here. It's called a pie safe for food storage. It's made of, it's got panels of tin with holes punched in it, and the holes allow air to circulate inside while preventing any easy access. But if you look down at the legs of this pie safe, you'll see that they're slightly discolored at the bottom. And it's because you actually would have placed the legs of this piece of furniture into small dishes of water or even poison in order to prevent anything from crawling up the outside and getting into your food. And so anytime someone says how nice it must have been to have lived at the Merchant's House, that is what I think about, and just how horrible that sounds, having things crawling up your furniture. Above the pie safe and also above the sink, you'll notice the servant call bells in this kitchen. Each bell had a different chime and connected to a different room in the house. Having a different chime for each room is useful for a couple of reasons. First, there is no need to look up. If Bridget's in the middle of chopping vegetables or kneading bread dough or heating water, she doesn't have to look up to see which bell is ringing. And also, if the bells are labeled, you need to know what the labels say. And so Bridget does not need to know how to read in order for these bells to serve their function. This work is extremely physically demanding. We talked about that coal bucket. You can imagine heating water, working over that stove. Bridget is coming into contact with fire on a regular basis. Ironing is a task that often caused really serious injury. And this is scary because while there is a lot of job opportunity here in New York, there's not a lot of job security. And nobody is going to hire a servant who is injured or sick. If you had a mild injury or a mild illness and the other servants could cover for you, you could rest and recover, but you could very easily be dismissed and turned out of a home if you were sick or injured for too long. The garden off the back of the house today is a very beautiful space. Our gardener does a lovely job, and it's a great space to come and enjoy beautiful weather. However, when the Treadwells lived here, this was a workspace. The path that you see around the perimeter of the garden is original, but the center areas of the garden would have simply been covered with grass. And this was an area used for doing chores. Laundry might have been done out here. Any sort of kitchen chores that you could do outside were done out in the garden. There was also a privy out in the garden here in this back corner, the back right-hand corner. And so for the Treadwells, you probably wouldn't have wanted to spend much time out here, particularly in the warmer months. There probably was a relatively foul smell back in the garden because of that privy. However, the garden is also an access point to the outside world. There would have been a gate at the back of the garden to allow delivery men access to the house. And this means that this is a place where Gertrude can sort of meet with other servants from the neighborhood. They could, chat through that gate, do some gossiping, or a way to have friends or relatives visit you sort of surreptitiously. Since there is such little time off, these types of visits are really crucial to Bridget's social life, as well as her relationship with other servants. Her main source of community outside of her work is the Catholic Church, is her church community. And the Catholic Church was the main way all of these young girls stayed in contact with one another, stayed connected to Ireland, and met people. They would attend Mass, meet with friends, get news from home. And the church often even held dances or other social gatherings where these young women might meet eligible husbands. So back inside the house, once the family is up in the morning and they're downstairs for breakfast, breakfast would be served in the family room. And so again, this speaks to that choreographed dance we talk about. While the family is eating their breakfast, Bridget must use that time to make her way upstairs to the parlors to prepare the room for that day's activities. So climbing the stairs up to the parlor floor here, and we will enter the front parlor. This is, as you can see, a very different room from the family room that we saw downstairs. The parlor is the most formal room in the house. And because the parlors are sort of a public space and used primarily for entertaining, it was a high priority for the Treadwells and therefore for Bridget to keep the parlors looking their best. So on a regular day, this would have involved dusting, maintaining the upholstery, and cleaning the fireplaces. Lighting was also a major source of work for Bridget. She was in charge of maintaining the candles, trimming the wicks and cleaning the wax, refilling and cleaning the oil lamps, and lighting and cleaning all of the fixtures including in the house, including these bronze gas chandeliers or a gasolier. A chandelier implies that you're burning a candle, and so a gasolier burns gas. The Treadwells installed gas lighting in the house in the 1850s, and so these fixtures would have been new when Bridget worked here in 1855. The gasoliers made a huge difference to lighting in the 19th century. Before, when the family was relying on candles and oil lamps, candles flicker, which of course is very romantic for a dinner party today, but not super useful if you're trying to read a book or do needlework. Oil lamps, like you see on the mantelpiece in that photo to the right, had a brighter, steadier flame, but they burn animal fat like whale oil, which had a foul smell. It produced a lot of smoke, and it was very expensive. And so to make this transition to gas lighting was really revolutionary. However, I can also imagine Bridget's horror when these fixtures were turned on for the first time. There must have been a tremendous amount of dust and debris from the construction of installing these fixtures. But then also imagine turning the lights on in a room and having the whole room brightly lit for perhaps the first time. And you can see all those little areas of dirt that you might have missed when the room was more dimly lit. It must have been really horrifying. Speaking of dirt, some of the more complicated for Bridget in these parlors are these lace curtains. The lace curtains, of course, look very beautiful, but they also serve a very functional purpose of keeping the filth from the New York City streets from getting inside the parlors. As you can imagine, this was a losing battle. These are basically your 19th century window screens. Bridget would have spent countless hours cleaning these lace curtains and all the dirt that snuck past them. A deep cleaning would have happened twice a year and would have been one of the busiest times for Bridget and the other servants. The Treadwells would hire outside help for very heavy tasks like cleaning the chimneys, but Bridget was still expected to do a lot of the heavy cleaning, including these large pure mirrors you see between the windows, cleaning the paintings, and also cleaning the carpets. For regular daily cleaning, Bridget would sweep the carpets throughout the rooms with a broom. Unlike today, when wall-to-wall carpeting is installed in one very large piece, carpeting in the 19th century was laid down with strips, with the pattern matched up like wallpaper. So if you look closely at this photograph, you can see where these seam lines are, sort of at the top and the bottom of this image. And so during a deep cleaning, the carpet could actually be pulled up and removed in order to be deep cleaned with a carpet beater outside. Again, this is a tremendously physically demanding job. Exposure to the grandeur of the Treadwells' home certainly would have impacted Bridget. Remember, she is coming from a rural and isolated background in Ireland, and seeing houses like this one and the social dynamics of the merchant class was aspirational to many girls like Bridget, who wanted to adapt this American lifestyle to their own homes. The cultural and economic gap, however, was wide and hard to cross. The piano in this room is one of the most important pieces in these rooms because of how important music was to social life. And for Bridget, you can imagine her awe looking at an instrument like this. The Treadwell's piano would have been the equivalent of several years' rent at a tenement apartment downtown. However, cultural exchange, did work both ways. And so familiarity with Irish culture through servants like Bridget did seep into life of the Treadwells as well. So the popularity of Irish music was one way that this would have happened at the time. So we know that there are Irish ballads that young women like the Treadwells would have played on their piano. And so you can imagine how strange for Bridget to hear sort of traditional music that she heard back home in Ireland coming from this extremely expensive piano in her new home. The song to the right of your screen is sheet music of the song Paddy O'Rafferty, which is a traditional Irish tune that was first published in New York in 1812. So we've seen the front parlor. If we turn around now, we can look into the rear parlor. The rear parlor was slightly less formal than the front parlor, and the two rooms were typically used independently of one another. You can see the photo to the left there with the pocket doors closed between the two rooms. The rear parlor is sometimes known as the dining parlor, and if guests came to a dinner party, the rear parlor was set up as a dining room. And dinner service was a huge part of social life for families like the Treadwells. And so it absolutely would have been a huge part of Bridget's day if the Treadwells were hosting a dinner. Dinners for guests were incredibly complicated, and so the servants in the house would have been participating throughout the day to help get ready for a party and then to clean up after. Since the parlors are the most public space in the house, the servants also sort of became part of the way to showcase wealth to visitors, and styles of dining changed in order to include servants more. The way that food was served changed over the course of the 19th century. At the beginning of the 19th century, when the Treadwells first moved into this house, dinner parties were served in what was known as the Old English style, where all of the food was piled onto the table, and guests were awed by the sheer quantity of food. It was all served at the same time, what we might think of as family style today. However, in the mid-19th century, dining and food became a lot more complicated, and French food became very fashionable. So the style of dining changed from this old English style, which was sort of a family style, help yourself, to a style of dining known as à la Russe, where the servants would serve each course directly to the guests. So the servants would walk around the table and individually serve portions onto each guest's plate. And so you see to the right of your screen, sort of a dinner setting place for this sort of style of dining. In this style of dining, it's the silver and the glassware and the china that really takes center stage, along with servants like Bridget, who have to learn all of these intricate rules for how to serve at a dinner party. So as dinner parties like this became really important ways that wealthy families entertained, Bridget would have been expected to learn all of these very intricate rules. She would have had to know how to serve each course, how to hold and present herself, and when it was appropriate to speak, if at all. The cook was in charge of managing the whole dinner party, and it's likely that the most senior maid would be present during the dining. Becoming a senior maid is something that Bridget probably aspired to, as it paid a lot more, and it came with more freedom and more responsibility. The senior maid also would have been in charge of training Bridget in one of her most important jobs, answering the door. This is a tremendous responsibility. Bridget needed to speak good English to answer the door. She needed to know how to present herself. And most importantly, she needed to know who to let in and how to speak with guests. Social rules were probably something that took a lot of explaining. In answering the door, one of the newest and most foreign customs for Bridget to learn is the ritual of ceremonial calling. Of course, there are no telephones in the 19th century. And so, in order to keep in touch with friends and neighbors, women would go on what was known as a ceremonial call. You see here Eliza Treadwell's calling card to the right of your screen. It's about the size of a business card and just printed with her name, Mrs. Seabury Treadwell. So, when going on a ceremonial call, women would ring the doorbell and Bridget would answer. And the caller then had the option of either just leaving her card, almost like leaving a voicemail or sending a text message today, sort of a, hi, I stopped by, I'm thinking of you, or she could place an in-person visit. Of course, it's possible that Mrs. Treadwell wasn't ready to receive callers or that she just wasn't interested in seeing a particular person. And so that means that Bridget has to have a really clear sense of Mrs. Treadwell's social life so that she knows who to admit and who to turn away. If Mrs. Treadwell is not available for a call, or if she doesn't want to see a certain someone, Bridget would tell that caller that Mrs. Treadwell was not at home. The vestibule here at the front of the house also features a faux marble painting technique on the walls, which you see in the lower right of your screen. This was painted with a turkey feather meant to mimic the look of marble. It's an incredibly expensive technique and would have been a really impressive first look at the house for visitors. And so once guests are all set to visit with Mrs. Treadwell in the parlors, Bridget can head upstairs to the bedroom floor to clean those up for the day. So here we are on the bedroom floor, and we'll begin here in the front bedroom. So while the family is receiving callers, or if Mr. Treadwell is working, Bridget would be up here to clean and tidy the bedrooms. She spent time resetting the fires and making the bed. These tasks, while similar to how they might work today, required a lot of steps and were very time consuming. Making the bed could actually take two servants almost an hour to flip and fluff the mattress and air out all the linens. Again, you can imagine how physically demanding this work is. As was cleaning and setting the fireplaces, this would have required Bridget to lay a cloth across the floor to ensure that soot doesn't travel all over the room and cover the bed linens. She'd have to then clean out the entire fireplace and relay the coals. This is the room at the front of the house where Seabury Treadwell died in March of 1865 of kidney failure. Sickness absolutely would have provided extra work for Bridget and the other servants. She might have had to go fetch the doctor or run other errands that weren't part of her usual work. There's also, of course, additional laundry when someone is sick, special meals to be prepared, and the household is just not running normally. We've talked a lot about sort of the choreography in a house like this and how important routine is. And so any break to that routine would have been just really disruptive to the household. not to mention the stress of having sickness in the house. Seabury Treadwell died of kidney failure, but contagious diseases were rampant, and the fear of catching sick herself must have often been on Bridget's mind. Seabury Treadwell, as we said, died in the house in 1865, and his funeral also took place in the house. And so, again, things like funerals required a lot of extra work for the servants. Cleaning the house, preparing the house for guests would have been just really disruptive and a lot of extra work, on top of just the pervasive sense of grief in the house. The rear bedroom here is Eliza Treadwell's bedroom, and this is another big cultural difference for Bridget. Wealthy families like the Treadwells typically had husbands and wives sleep separately in separate bedrooms. And this would have been very different from how Bridget grew up. She would have grown up likely living very closely with her family in sort of a crowded living situation with perhaps extended family living in the room or in the house with her in very close quarters. For this house to have separate rooms for a husband and wife is a real difference. Eliza also used this room for entertaining close friends. And so Bridget had to know what the plan was for that day so that she could be sure the room was clean and ready for whatever Mrs. Treadwell needed. Certainly, you wouldn't want to be in the middle of cleaning the fireplace with a cloth draped over the carpet and your hands covered in soot when Eliza showed up with a friend looking for a private place for a chat. Women also gave birth at home in the 19th century. And so, similar to sickness, childbirth would have provided or would have created a lot of extra work for Bridget and the other servants. Bridget, we know, is here in 1855. Had she started in 1854, she would have been here when oldest daughter Elizabeth Treadwell gave birth to her only daughter, Lily, in October of 1854. And so having a baby in the house also would have made a lot more work. The hat tub that you see on the floor in this room looks like a straw hat that's been turned upside down. We talked a little bit about plumbing in the kitchen, and while there was indoor plumbing in the kitchen from the time the house was built, indoor plumbing didn't come to the rest of the house until later in the 19th century. And so if the family wanted to bathe, they would do it in a tub like this one. And so Bridget would set this tub up in the bedroom and then would have to heat water down in the kitchen and carry that hot water up 2 flights of stairs to dump it in this tub. And then once Mrs. Treadwell was finished with her bath, the tub had to be emptied and that water carried back downstairs again. It's also Bridget's job, you see on the floor here, a chamber pot. Of course, no indoor plumbing means no indoor toilets, means chamber pots for indoor use. And so it was Bridget's job to clean out the chamber pots every morning by dumping the contents into a big tin bucket that was used exclusively for that purpose. Bridget would then dispose of it in the privy outside and then clean that tin bucket. The most hated task of every servant, I'm sure. So we're going to climb the stairs now up to the next flight, which is children's bedrooms. The children's bedrooms today serve as museum offices. Childcare would have been part of Bridget's job in a family like this one with many children. And so servants often would have been asked to look after a child. However, childcare would not have been one of her primary responsibilities. The proximity of servants to children and the amount of time they spent together caused a lot of tension and worry in many households because your servants are primarily Catholic. There are countless articles written in ladies' magazines about how to protect your children from your Catholic servants. And this sort of fear that your Catholic servants might try to convert the children to Catholicism. There are these absurd stories about servants absconding with children to have them baptized in the Catholic Church. Of course, Bridget is probably just trying to get her work done. She was very busy. This was hard work. You can't imagine Bridget had a lot of time to be absconding with children. If we climb another flight up to these servants' quarters here, you see that there is a large work area in the center of the room. And then we will step into this small bedroom here at the front of the house. At the end of a long day, Bridget would come up to this room to rest. This is a difficult job with long hours, and so she likely did not spend very much time up in this room. There are two servant bedrooms up in this floor, and the servants slept two to a room. Metal beds were provided for servants. Metal beds were recommended as a means of preventing bed bugs, which can't burrow into metal like they can into wood. Of course, there are all sorts of class implications there, that you as a wealthy homeowner feel very comfortable sleeping on a wooden bed yourself, but that you fear that your Irish servants must somehow be more prone to vermin and need this added protection. Um, in the parlors, looking at the piano, we discussed about how Bridget would have aspired to this new wealthy lifestyle that she witnesses. And the same holds true for clothing. And so you see this mannequin that we have on display, excuse me, in the servant's bedroom. She's not wearing sort of what we think of as a stereotypical uniform. If Bridget were lucky, she might receive hand-me-downs from the Treadwell family, perhaps at Christmas. And we know a lot of young servant girls spent a lot of their wages on clothing in the 19th century. The variety available in New York City was so much greater than the few handmade things they would have had access to in Ireland. And particularly later in the 19th century, once ready-to-wear clothing was readily available, these young women spent a lot of their wages on clothing. You can imagine you're a 19-year-old girl in New York and you've got a little bit of disposable income. What are you going to spend it on? Bridget would not have worn a uniform. Servants in the 19th century, in the early part of the century, didn't wear uniforms. They just wore their regular street clothes. But as servants bought fancier clothing, this often irritated the families that they worked for, who saw them as sort of reaching above their station. And particularly when mass-produced clothing becomes more common, if everyone's shopping at Macy's or Lord & Taylor, the idea that your maid might buy the same dress that you have was deeply upsetting for many wealthy women. And so this idea of a servant reaching above her station was so upsetting that that's part of why uniforms were introduced and were required later on in the century. Without a lot of time off and with room and board covered, women and girls like Bridget were saving a lot of money. So much of this money was sent home to Ireland to care for their families in the midst of famine. The Emigrant Savings Bank, pictured here, was established in New York City in 1850 by the Irish Emigrant Society, which was founded in 1841 for the protection of immigrants from Ireland. The Emigrant Savings Bank offered a safe place to keep your money and a way to send money home to relatives in Ireland. By the 1870s, it was estimated that a third of all money circulating in Ireland actually came from America. And money that wasn't staying in Ireland was being used to bring family here to America. Remember, it costs $20 to bring someone over, and these girls are making somewhere between $3 and $4 a month. So you save up for a few months and you're able to bring over your relatives. Women like Bridget were responsible for bringing over thousands of their family members to America, starting a chain migration so strong that by 1901, over 3 million women had emigrated from Ireland during the 19th century, which is actually more than were left in Ireland at that time. Many of these women, like Bridget, entered New York through Castle Garden, pictured here, which opened as an immigrant landing depot in August of 1855. So during the next 34 years, over 8 million people entered the United States through Castle Garden. 2 out of every 3 immigrants to the United States passed through Castle Garden. It was ultimately closed in April of 1890 as Ellis Island became the sort of main entry point. This mass immigration was sparked by the wages of young women like Bridget, and it made Irish culture a definitive part of the makeup of New York City. And so as time went on, after fighting prejudice, the Irish did assimilate and gain political power, and Irish history is now woven into the history of our city. So Bridget's story really is inextricably linked to the New York City that we know today. However, it's important to remember that Bridget didn't know that she was making history. Bridget was a lonely girl. She was far away from home, trying to adjust to a strange place and a different culture, and to build a better life for herself and for her family. Many of the issues that we've talked about on today's tour are still affecting domestic workers here in New York City and around the world. And so while we might not know that much about Bridget Murphy and her fears and hopes and dreams, we can say one thing for certain. The lifestyle that was enjoyed by the Treadwell family and their peers would have been absolutely impossible without Bridget. We've got time for a couple questions, and so do feel free to pop them into the Q&A feature. But first, I do want to talk briefly about a serious threat to the Merchant's House. As many of you may know, for the last 12 years, the Merchant's House has been fighting proposed development next door, construction that is guaranteed to cause irreparable damage to our landmark building and will force us to close the museum to the public for at least 2 years. Last December, in a shocking betrayal, the Landmarks Preservation Commission actually voted to approve the development, in spite of overwhelming and unanimous opposition from the community, from preservation organizations, from public officials, engineers, and architects. This disastrous vote is really a warning to every other landmark in New York City. If this can happen to the Merchant's House, the very first building in Manhattan designated a landmark in 1965, then every landmark in New York is at risk. We have just launched a letter writing campaign urging the Adams administration and the buildings department to step in to protect the Merchant's House, a city-owned interior and exterior landmark and a beloved and irreplaceable educational and community resource. Please take just 30 seconds to sign your name and submit a letter. I've just put the direct link here in the chat, and if you click it right now, you'll be able to submit your letter before we are even finished tonight. And yes, please submit a letter even if you don't live in New York City. Tourism, as I'm sure you know, is an economic engine in New York, and so it's important that the administration hears from supporters from all over. If you have already submitted your letter, thank you, and please share this information with your family, your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, and encourage them to submit letters as well. After tonight's tour, I do hope that you have a better understanding of what a special place the Merchant's House is, and just how devastating it would be if the house no longer existed. So we do have time for a few questions if anybody has any. Let's see, somebody asks, how many servants were at the Merchant's House on a given day? That's a great question. So we know only what's in the census. And so the census tells us that there are 4 women who are living and working here in this house. And so what we can say is that there are at least 4 servants at the house on a given day. It's likely that there were also day servants. It's likely that there were servants who maybe were hired in, particularly if you were having a big party, you might need additional help. We also know that the census tells us that there are 4 female servants. There may have been male servants who simply didn't live at the house, and so there's no record of them on the census. So the answer is that at least 4 and possibly more. Somebody asks whether Bridget ever married. We don't know about Bridget specifically, but many of these young women did marry and leave service. Marriage would have been the end of a job like this at the Merchant's House. Women who were married did not work in houses like the Merchant's House as a live-in servant. A married woman could serve as a servant where she commuted in and was sort of a servant by day, but didn't live here at the house. Or perhaps a married woman might have worked with her husband if he owned a shop or something like that. Or could have taken in laundry or other chores that she could do from her own home. But Bridget, once she married, would no longer work in a house like the Merchant's House. Somebody asks if there's going to be a recording, and yes, we are recording tonight's talk, and it will be up on our YouTube page tomorrow. All of our virtual events are available on our YouTube page at it's Merchant's House, excuse me, it's youtube.com/Merchant's House Museum. And if you go to our website at merchantshouse.org, it's linked there as well. So you'll be able to share this video with your friends or watch it again if you're so inclined. Well, I think that that is all the time that we have for this evening. But I do hope, after seeing the house virtually, that you come and visit us in person. The Merchant's House is currently open to visitors on Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. And we have options for both guided and self-guided tours. So we do hope to see you sometime soon. Tonight's program was offered free of charge, but to support the museum and our future programming and our fight against the development next door, please do consider joining us as a member or making a donation. You can donate online at merchantshouse.org/support. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. It's been a delight to have you all here. We hope to see you sometime soon and have a wonderful St. Patrick's Day.